Okay, today is Tuesday, October the 9th. We are at the Blanco Library, and the interviewee today is Kathleen English. Our cameraman is Tommy Cook, and I'm Barney Klein. Kathleen, we're delighted to have you here. The focus of today's interview is going to be really your time in Blanco, and for us to try to see Blanco through your eyes through the period of 45 years I think that you lived here. But before we get to the Blanco part of it, could we just briefly get some of your earlier history and where you were born and sort of some of the early influences in your life that
Well, I don't know that anybody would be interested, but I was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma. My father was a rig building contractor, and so we followed the oil fields, and I lived in 3 states by the time I was 6. We lived in Oklahoma and in southeastern Kansas, following the oil fields, and in eastern Texas. And when got time for us to go to school, the family moved into Fort Worth. We went to private Catholic schools, and we stayed there through my graduation. And then we moved to East Texas. The oil boom was on in East Texas. And so while I was there, I had some friends. The father of one of them was a lawyer, and I kept going into his office. He had a library at his home, and I kept going in there and looking at the books. And he finally noticed it, and so he gave me some law books to read that he suggested, which Blackstone was one of them. And when I had read enough of them, and he thought that I had the mind for a lawyer. And so he talked to my mother and father and said he had an office in Houston. He was an appellate lawyer in oil and gas minerals. And if I would go down there and work for him, and then I could go to night school, law school. In Houston, there is, and was, a South Texas College of Law, which is the downtown campus in Houston. And so I would work in the Expression Building in the daytime, and I would go to law school at night. And I did that until he declared one day, he said, "You know enough to take the bar exams." And because he would coach me in the office. In other words, I was, we'd have conferences, he'd let me sit in, and that sort of thing. So he said it was time for me to take a bar examination. So I went to Austin and took the bar examination in the House of Representatives. I rented a typewriter, and there the board of legal examiners were there and in a separate room. And as each person finished their examination, their written examination, they were called in for oral examination. So I submitted that. So then I passed, so that I was a lawyer, and I was 21. And so I continued to work for this law firm until this mentor died.
I'm just curious, how many women entered law back in those days?
In the law school, there were about 3 or 4 of us.
Out of
very, very few.
Out of how many? I mean,
I don't know.
But very few women.
Yeah, very few. Mm-hmm.
So that was somewhat of a bold step on your part. Or maybe you didn't think of it that way.
No, I didn't feel it that way at all. I was very fascinated with the subject.
With the law. And it sounded like this gentleman was a very important mentor in
Yes, he was
your
a
life.
great influence in my life. And of course, in doing appellate law, I did a lot of research. I had a good background.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. That's interesting that there were so few women. What it was there feeling that women weren't welcome in law, or was it more a matter
in the school environment, no, there was no difference.
You didn't feel that you were...
And we would all study together in the evenings, meet somebody's house, and no, I never felt the need.
Growing up and traveling a lot as a kid, I mean, your family moved a good bit. Did that influence the way you
I guess so.
looked at the world? And
I guess so.
you've continued to be an adventurer. Where did you get your adventuresome spirit? I mean, we'll hopefully touch on that later. I mean, you've flown airplanes, you've done things that are out of the ordinary.
Well, my mother said that when I was 2 years old, I ran away, and they found me at the railroad track. So I presume it was inborn.
You've been a gypsy for...
So I've been a gypsy ever since.
So tell us about when you came to Blanco and what brought you here and what your early impressions were of Blanco. But maybe before that, let me just jump to something else. Those early years were the Depression years, were they not?
Yes.
Could you share some of your thoughts and memories about what that was like?
Well, really, it didn't touch me because we always had play at home, and growing up, it didn't make a big impression, except when we moved to East Texas. My father was a worried man, which I recognized, and he had crews men working up. He's a rig building contractor. Of course, they were building rigs for oil production all the time, and I remember that he was worried about the payroll, was sure that the crews were paid, and the crews were paid first. We did without rather than the crews, and I was aware of that, but I never missed a meal of it. Didn't curtail anything I ever did. So
it didn't impact you directly,
impact
but I mean, you know you remember how different the world must have been back then from today. People making without just the essentials.
I was aware there were a lot of people, of course, coming into East Texas looking for work. There was a lot of vandalism. Our house was robbed a couple of times. That went with the times.
Yeah. Okay. I know during the war years, I know that you joined in a group, I think in Dallas, and some war support efforts that led you to one of your adventures.
Yeah, one of my adventures. Yes, everybody wanted to do something after December 7th. And so there was a lot of organizations formed at that time to do something in the war effort. And so I was with a group of women, working women, and we all did various things. So I chose to learn to fly because they were doing some courier service out of Lovefield. And so I'd get up early in the morning and go out to a little field and take flying lessons. And in the meantime, of course, I was studying for the written exam. So I went out to Lovefield and took the day off from my work. Went out to Lovefield and took the exam. And that's been interesting all my life because I had to learn about the clouds, I had to learn about the weather, I had to learn about the wind, and in connection with the flying. So flying is just part of it, the actual flying. And it's made me interested always in the weather and the weather conditions, and recognizing I can call the clouds by name, that sort of thing. It's been interesting. But anyway, then I went on vacation, and my mother and father were then living in Coleman, Texas. And one of the primary base trainers at Coleman lived across the street from us. And so he brought a plane out to the field about a block from where my mother and father lived. And I finished my flying lessons and soloed there on this open field. And then when I got through, I walked home.
I bet you celebrated that night after your first solo.
No, they just took it in stride.
They just expected exceptional things of you. Were there other women in the program or that were learning to fly? Were you one of them?
Yes.
Yeah.
In Dallas, the girl that I lived with was a nurse. And by the way, she worked with LBJ at that time. She was in that youth administration.
Really? When he was...
but he was working with that.
Senator, I guess he was senator at that.
Youth administration or something like that. And of course, that was when he was just working.
Well, I don't know much of that history, but what was there, what was it called, the Women's Air Force group, was that something that was helping support and encourage this activity?
Yes, that was occurring in all the cities. I have a friend who was in Houston at that time, and she actually did a lot of courier work. And would fly generals from this base to this base, that sort of thing. We were not part of the Army.
The idea was for women to do the flying to free up the men for combat activity, I assume. Well, then you you got diverted, I think.
This is going on and on. I don't know if anybody's really interested.
No.
Anyway, when my mentor died, I went into Fort Worth to a law firm that was doing appellate work, and I worked for them a couple of years or so. And then I moved. I needed to broaden my horizons a little bit, so I went to Dallas and worked for an investment company, and it was there that the war started, that sort of thing. And so then the reason I didn't pursue the flying was because the major oil companies were looking for women lawyers in their legal departments because their young men were being called into the service. And so a man named Lucius Maribel Lamar, and I remember he was a direct descendant of one of the Texas, and he used the full name. Anyway, he called on me from New Orleans, and wanted me to come down there and work in the legal department down there. So I did. So that started my flying career.
How long did you live in New Orleans?
11 years.
11 years. Yeah, we lived in New Orleans.
Everybody should live in New Orleans when they're in their 30s. It's great.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. We lived there for almost 25 years. I was at Tulane most of the time.
Then you know it.
Most of the time. Yes, I do. I still miss the food.
I took some French lessons in Tulane.
Really? Well, let's focus then. Fast forward onto Blanco and how you happened to come and when that was.
Anybody that moves to Blanco visits all the cities around, towns around, and decides which hill country town they're looking for.
Well, somewhere there you got married, right?
Oh yeah,
Jim,
yeah.
right?
That's the reason I left New Orleans. I went to Houston. Yes, of course, married an oil man. So the oil business has taken care of me all my life. Anyway,
Kathleen, I'm going to interrupt you for one quick question. We interviewed recently someone from the Glasscock family, family Glasscock, and his father was very much involved in the oil world. Does that name?
yeah, I know him.
Do you do? Stanley?
Yes.
His father was
He
W.D.
and his brother Mike had operations in East Texas. And so when I was in Houston, he and Mike, who I knew better than, what is his name, Stan?
Stanley's the one in San Antonio, but his father was W.D.
Yeah, and they would come into the office. They were
Really? Interesting.
So anyway, they would tell me the wonderful circus story tales.
Oh, you know all that.
Yeah, I know all
wonderful
that.
stories. That are wonderful stories.
In fact, I was telling Bonnie the other day that when I received my law license, Mike Glasscock, who was the elephant man in the circus, gave me a briefcase with my name in gold letters. Oh, that was the first gift I got.
Oh my goodness.
It was great.
Still have that?
I still have
You
it.
still do? Wonderful. Well,
His wife, by the way, was the knife thrower in the circus.
well, we've seen some of those pictures. Stanley has an enormous collection of old photographs. And you haven't seen that. Well, no one really yet has seen that interview, but you'd be interested.
Yes,
in
I would. I'd like
You'll have to see that. Well, then let's back to Blanco now.
Okay.
We're easing up on Blanco. How did you pick Blanco?
Well, we selected Blanco because it had a Catholic church, and it was within 50 miles of two cities. And I had to have a city available to me. And so Blanco filled the bill, so we looked around.
Well, did you consider yourself a city girl or a country girl?
I'm a city girl because I'm growing up years.
I grew up in cities primarily. Even.
Yeah, and I've always enjoyed concerts and theater.
You didn't want to be too far from a good library.
That's right. That's right.
That's also.
It's always. Anyway, we selected Blanco and moved out on Rocky Road, just outside the city limits. Shall I tell them about the first night?
Sure, sure. First impressions.
We moved in from Houston. We moved in the first night and finally fell into bed, exhausted. And I woke up with this piercing scream just outside the window. And of course, I came up out of the bed, and anyway, my husband recognized it. It was a peafowl. Didn't they apparently scream? Anyway, that was my first night. Anyway, I asked my husband at that night if we couldn't sell the place that I was through.
You didn't like those night sounds.
The peafowls were taken away the next day. Anyway, let's see, that was in the 60s. Well then, we were well received. The lady across the street brought us a cake. Ruth Taylor with the Women's Club drove up in the driveway and invited me to join the Women's Club. The Catholic Church was doing a church census at that time, so we joined in with them, and so we found out where everybody lived and who they were.
It didn't take you long
Didn't take very long
to feel like you were part of the community.
Anyway, of course, about that time, that was right after Kennedy had died and Johnson was president, so they opened up the boyhood home in Johnson City, and so I went up there and became a docent with that, and so I was very surprised one day to have the White House call me and tell me that I had been cleared to go to the ranch.
That's a great story.
Lady Bird was going to entertain the docents. And,
Tell us about that. That's an interesting little piece of history. What was that like?
well, anyway, and then I got a Christmas present from them, and they sent me a little dish with a picture of the White House, of the house at Johnson, Stonewall. And I got greetings from them every year.
Is that something that Lady Bird did periodically to
Yes,
entertain?
yes. Once a year, she would come down in the summertime and would entertain all the docents.
Extraordinarily gracious woman.
And so it was fun. Of course, that way we got to go into the house and see the room where Kennedy stayed and all that stuff.
Really?
It was a nice episode.
that's right. It's not easy to get into the house. I mean, you
No.
can't do that
No.
on tours. You get close to it, but certainly not into it. Well, Kathleen, you mentioned the women's club. Did that lead to other activities and interest in the town? I know you've been involved in with several different efforts and organizations.
Yes, but the Women's Club, of course, was the first because they solicited me, and that the library, of course, that was at that time behind the city hall in the barracks, and so we were there for some time. The local city attorney, and who was a past county attorney, lived here, Judge Harrison. Well, I had called on him when I first arrived and introduced myself and told him I proposed to do a little law practice, but with his permission, because he was the lawyer in the town. And so after we'd been there a while, he told me that there were some people that would give money to the library, but that we should be chartered so that they could get credit for the money. So this in '76, then we made a 501c3 organization out of the library, the Women's Club. And so then, wasn't very long after that, Mr. Williams, who was also a retired county attorney, gave us the choice of $25,000 or his house after he died. Well, the president of the Women's Club, Mary Virginia Chick, quickly said, "You take the land," which of course was the smart thing to do. So we stayed in the Quonset hut for 10 more years, but we ended up with his house and a lot here in town, and which we sold, and that gave us the money to buy the building on the square. We were in the on the square where the newspaper office is now and the Chamber of Commerce office. That was the building we bought, and it was interesting. Of course, it was divided as it is now, and it was a paint store. And so we just continued to let him rent. So we needed the space, but we had to redo to make it available for library purposes. And particularly in the back, it was really a mess back there. So we didn't have any money. We would put all our money in the property. So we called on the county commissioner to get the, well, we called them the misdemeanor boys, the boys that are in jail at Vernon, who like to work because they don't want to stay in jail. And so they came down. They came down in a van and they brought their sack lunch with them. And of course they had a supervisor. Anyway, they did the work, the heavy work in the back of it. And so then when we got ready to move to this location, some 10 years later, we called on them again, and the stacks were set up by the misdemeanor boys. But anyway, it was interesting. Most of them had never been in a library. It was new to them.
That's interesting. I misdemeanor boys.
That's what we call
it. That's a nice term. That's a nice term.
But it's not the violent crimes. They're all usually young men, and
but they did a lot of physical work.
They want to work rather than sit around someplace. They put them to work.
How did the library volunteers come about? I mean, now it's quite a sizable group, but back in those days, there were relatively few, I assume. Was that a spontaneous thing or organized effort?
Well, of course, it was sponsored by the Women's Club, which was a loose organization. It wasn't federated. Mm-hmm. And the people that were interested from the club would volunteer, and that's the way it started. And then the people who were interested moved in, just liked to volunteer. Mm-hmm.
And that group has grown
And
through
it's
the
just
years.
So
Yeah.
we now have some 40 odd every week.
You couldn't do without volunteers.
Oh,
now.
no.
There's no way you could function without volunteers.
But it's a pleasant atmosphere, and people who like books, it's,
Kathleen, you practiced law here then for a number of years,
Yes.
right? And was that an easy transition, or did you find resistance to?
no. I always officed at my home, and if they didn't want me, they didn't come out there.
Yeah. And the quote competition wasn't didn't create barriers
No.
for you.
And of course, as soon as I'd make some money, well, then I'd go on a trip.
Tell us about some of those trips. I know you love to travel. You continued traveling. It seems periodically when I meet you, you come back from some wonderful place.
To travel, I noticed in the CNN last night, they were talking about the Northwest Passage. They're going to open it up. I would love to do that.
Sounds typical. What are some of your more memorable trips and places you've been?
Oh, yeah. Well, let's see. We were talking about cold weather and the Northwest Passage, which I love to do. The year after my husband died, I didn't know what to do with myself, so I got on a cruise ship and went around South America and flew to Valparaiso. And when we got down to Puerto Arenas on the tip of South America, there were a bunch of us. We chartered a plane and flew into Antarctica. So we crossed the floor there where all the icebergs were, and then flew into. That was really exciting. There were just enough of us so that everybody had a window seat, and we had a daring pilot who he couldn't land, of course, but he went into the runway so low that the wheels almost touched. And so all the boys at the American station down there all came out and waved and carried on. And of course we didn't get to the pole because that would have been so we chartered it for 6 hours, 3 hours in and 3 hours out. Well, we would have had to be 6 hours in and 6 hours out to go across the pole. So anyway, we flew around. Everything was icy, you know.
It sounds like
But it was an exciting
adventure. But you did spend time on land in Patagonia?
No, we couldn't touch it. No, we couldn't.
No, I don't mean in
Oh yes.
Antarctica, but in South America.
Yes, it was about a 2-month cruise. We went through the Straits of Magellan and up to Rio. And
some of the roughest water in the world, I think.
And then we went, when we got to the northern tip of South America, the ship went into the Amazon basin. And
sounds absolutely wonderful.
It was
sounds typical of your adventuresome spirit. Are there some other trips that popped to mind?
Yes. Well, of course, we talked about yesterday. We went around the world, my husband and I. In '66, that was the year before the '67 war. And at that time, when we went up the Red Sea, it was going to take 3 days for the ship to get through Port Said into the Mediterranean. So we rented a car and went to Cairo and then flew into Jordan and did the Holy Land. And of course at that time it was in Jordan. We couldn't go to Galilee because that was on the Israeli side. And they still had the barbed wire fences. It was definitely a divided world.
The You mentioned earlier this morning that this lovely outfit you're wearing came from Greece. Was that a different trip, I assume?
Yeah, that's different. Let's see, that was, I think this was a South American trip. It was on the ship.
Oh, I see. But you've been to Greece and the Greek islands.
Yes, yes. While I was living in New Orleans before I married, my mother and I made a number of trips. It was unusual now. We flew on, I guess it'd be Pan American, went to New York and got on a clipper that made berths. And we slept across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
Those were the days.
And had real service back in those days, right?
I remember I was asleep and I heard my mother's voice saying, "Kathleen, get up, get up." And I woke up and she said, "We're in the Azores." We were. So I got up, got out on the ground. We went on that trip around, did the cities around the Mediterranean. We went to Madrid and to Cairo and Istanbul.
You've seen a remarkable amount. Amazing. Well, back to, I don't want to make Blanco sound sort of bland after those exotic travels, but I know you've been involved a lot with the courthouse efforts, and could you tell us a bit about that? Because that's sort of the soul of
I was aware
of our town.
That the townspeople were up in arms about the old courthouse, and of course it was a building that was breaking down. But I didn't get interested until Jonelle Haas approached me to be a guarantor on the loan. The National Historic Trust would loan them $100,000, but they wanted the loan guaranteed because the land was not worth much of the building at that point. So when I got money involved, of course I got interested, and I still am a life member of the courthouse group. But I was involved in the renovation, the restoration. And then we had to get more money, of course, and the Department of Transportation, TxDOT, was given some federal money with the idea of donating for tourists to make it more attractive. And so Clinton DeWolf and I went to Austin after we made application, and they gave us $360,000, which with that $100,000 we were able to renovate. So, well, it was interesting. Another little point is still being affected. We were a 501c3 organization, and they awarded us the money. But then they realized that the money could only be given to entities, state entities. So we approached the city of Blanco. So the money was funneled from the federal government to the state government to the city, to Blanco City, and then to us. And so in working with the city to get this done, we told the city, you can always have your council meetings on the second floor of the courthouse. We still do. That's how that came about.
Were you involved in a lot of legal work and getting the courthouse?
The things that needed to be done during my period. I was fortunate enough to be the president during the period of the renovation, and made it real interesting. So then when we had the opening, Governor Bush, who gave a dedication speech, I was the president. So I got in on the glory days. The hard basic work was done earlier on when the group were trying to get the city interested in, the community interested.
President Bush was here for the...
Yes, he came as governor. He came
No,
dedication.
the first President Bush. Or
No.
the second president. Okay, oh, you're right.
George
You're right.
W.
That's, of course. I have my...
Yeah, that
Chronology,
would be in the in the 90s, not 97, I think.
That's right. We, because I remember, wasn't Judd Prince's group, the Prince Construction involved with a lot of the renovation of the courthouse? Because I remember...
Yeah, I believe so. I can't remember. Of course, I always can think about Judd in connection with this. He did this renovation.
Well, that's true. But Judd actually built our house, the house that we live in now. And I remember him taking us to the courthouse and walking us through and pointing out a lot of the features of the renovation.
It was interesting in the renovation. They even went back to the base paint. They drug back in, and the base paint, the color it was, is what they have done in.
On the ceiling?
Yeah, somebody told me recently that they needed to put some new paint on the wood trim around the windows.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to get about changing. I said, oh, no, you'll ruin the authenticity. That red paint is the color of the original. The inside, everything, except the ceiling in the courtroom. When that was owned by the man that had a kind of a menagerie, remember he had a great big white polar bear stuffed. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I remember it.
Before my time.
Anyway, kind of a museum for a while.
Yeah.
And he's the one
floor.
that redid that ceiling. And of course, the Historical Society has always been unhappy with that. And every time there's a report from the Historical Society out of Austin about our courthouse, they always complain about the ceiling.
Kathleen, the library has been a big part of your life also. We touched on that in some of the earlier history, but tell us, where do you see this library going? How do you...
Well, as the town
view the library
community grows, we'll grow with it. There've been many changes in the town in the 40 years. Well, as all of you will recognize just in the times that you've been here. And,
could you, back in the early days here in Blanco in the 60s, could you have in your wildest dreams envisioned what the library has become and is becoming?
Just live one day at a time. Of course, now we're in the planning stages for another. We keep having to add 3,000 feet from the barracks building. We moved into the one on the square. We picked up 3,000 square feet. We moved from there here. We picked up 3,000 square feet, and we're fixing to do the same thing.
Well, I know
plans.
there's a very bold new vision for the library, and
well, we have to. As you can see, we're jammed at this point, and there are more functions in connection with the library now than there were. Just a place for books originally. We have, well, as you can see, just being around here, we have the children's programs, and we have they have the art group, and we're having the classic movies in the conference room now, and so it's things. We need more space constantly. Of course, we've always been poor. It's never from hand to mouth, the library. And when we wanted to move to computers, when we were on the square, this was in, what, early 90s or late 80s. We couldn't afford to have the books, what do you call the little things you read?
Microfiche?
No, you put on the book, the little...
Your barcode.
You put on the book.
Oh, the barcode is, yeah.
It's got a barcode.
Mhm.
We couldn't afford to have that done, and so Sandra Payne was in charge of the library at that time, and she broke that thing down and got all the volunteers to do their part, and we barcoded all the books ourselves, and we bought the first computers, and we went through the process, trial and error, but we did it. So then we were delighted to move in here, and we moved in with 26 computers.
That's not us. What if you let your imagination go? Where do you see 5, 10 years from now the library? What would be your vision of where we're going and what we can become?
Well, I don't know about 5 or 10 years. I do know we'll continue to need space, and as more and more things are happening in the libraries now, and it fills a need that people seem to have at this point. And definitely, they need the computers in the library, because a lot of people do not have computers in their homes.
Sure.
And of course, all the kids, the younger people, are used to using computers, and we're going to have more space for more computers. We have I don't know whether we've got any statistics on use. I know we keep records, everybody signs in when they use it, but our computers are used constantly by various members of the community. And
But
where is it going to go? I don't know. Who would have thought that 10 years ago that we'd be where we are now?
That's true. It's true. And if you think back, the library was really 20 years ago was just a little, in a way, insignificant place where a few people went.
Yeah, when we were in the barracks building behind the city hall, we didn't have a restroom, we didn't have a telephone, we just had books.
And I mean, the hope is that it'll evolve into even more of a central hub of activities in the
Yes,
community.
I think it'll be more of a town center. And that seems to be happening in the cities.
Good.
For small meetings particularly, you need space.
It helps fulfill the original vision of the Women's Club, as I understand it, was to bring culture
That's
to Blanco.
Yeah, in '37, when the ladies started it, it filled a need at that point, because you didn't come and go to Austin and San Antonio like they do now, and so they built a little cultural center of their own, and it's grown from that.
Just to go full cycle back, the Women's Club really was one of the first groups that you were involved with when you came here, and that generated so many of the things that you, the interest.
Well, I think you had mentioned yesterday the Yucca Garden Club was formed from the committee having to do with gardening at Women's Club, and then it just enlarged. And of course, it's still a viable little organization.
Glad you mentioned
So
that.
joined that earlier, not because I'm a gardener particularly, but it's a different set of people that were in the organization from the ones that I was in the church and the library situation, women's club. And it's still a going organization and feels a need. Well, all the crepe myrtles around town, you don't think anything about them until it's time for them to bloom. But there are crepe myrtles all over town. Well, the Yucca Garden Club sponsored. We went out and bought a whole bunch of crepe myrtles and sold them to everybody that would plant one. And we wanted to make the town aware of crepe myrtles, and so we did. And they're the organization that puts the creche scene in the downtown area every Christmas. I've forgotten how come we had those statues, but it's always a problem finding a barn to keep them in all year. But we do that, and then they twice a year they do something for the nursing home for Thanksgiving and Easter. So it's a community organization.
Do you think Blanco is different from other communities in this area? I always wonder that myself. We seem special in so many ways, and such a core of citizens that contribute.
Everybody here seems to cooperate. There are no divisions of any serious.
You would see them if anybody did. I mean, you'd be aware of them from
Yes.
a legal perspective.
Well, I think everybody would.
Yeah. Well, Kathleen, I want to thank you. You've been wonderful, and I don't want to tire you out of here with endless.
I don't know that anybody would be interested in this oral history, but.
Well, there'll be, I mean, I mentioned to you before that by popular demand, we've had more requests to interview Kathleen than just about, than anyone. I can promise you that.
My nose in a lot of things.